Hello, everybody. It's Matt again. In this week's discussion question, we were talking about the whole idea of measuring learning and redesigning learning spaces and the idea or concept of blended learning. So when we were talking about measuring learning, I was looking at the concept of nudging, shoving, and smacking when it came to using analytics or data to make informed decisions. And so we nudge students all the time. We give them choices. You could do this or this through nudging, and a lot of times it's moving somebody on their own accord. Shoving, meaning forcefully nudging people in the right direction. The author had mentioned taxes on cigarettes, and where the smack type of strategy comes in is restricting smoking altogether. So when I think about the whole idea of measuring learning, I often think about the last 5 minutes of class, which are one of the most underutilized time periods in an entire school day. When you think about it, if we just allow our students to pack up and a lot of discipline problems occur, we just do homework, we're wasting about 25 minutes of instruction every week, 2 50-minute class periods a month, and 18 50-minute class periods an entire school year. So that's really important. So how can we utilize that time more effectively to get the data that we need to nudge students in the right direction, to kind of shove them in the right direction and make data-informed decisions? And so there's a lot of ways that we can do that by just having formative types of assessments set up so that we can gather what students are learning. A lot of us use like a parking lot activity, but to use technology in that way, you could use a tool like Padlet, which gives you some different options for students to attach a video or a picture or text-based discussion of what they learned. There are tools like Google Forms, Quizzes, and Kahoot, which allow students to take a quiz. I like Quizzes. It's one of my favorites right now because students can do this for homework. They can do it at their own pace. And then, last but not least, kind of taking a step out of the traditional approach and allowing students to record videos like this through something like Flipgrid could be a really helpful tool to get qualitative data to understand, what students learned and what they need to do to move forward. And then we talked about the whole idea of redesigning learning spaces, and I think that corresponds really, really well with the whole idea of blended learning. Blended learning, obviously takes an online and a face-to-face approach and mixes them together. And so in a blended learning environment, there are a lot of parameters and a lot of things to consider. And one of the biggest things to consider is your learning space. How does that work? What does the learning environment look like? And so many teachers that I'm working with right now at Milton Hershey are designing flexible seating, flexible environments where students can collaborate, they can work individually, they can kind of work at their own space. Another thing too is that you're starting to see a lot more collaborative learning environments and learning spaces. We're starting to see that in a lot of libraries and a lot of places, learning spaces across the country where there's whiteboard tables, there's tables that can move very easily, there's monitors for students to plug in their device, students having access to something like an Apple TV or a Solstice system. So that's really, really helpful. And then the whole idea of designing a blended learning environment not only incorporates the online component, we do have to consider workflow. I mean, that's one of the big things, is how do you get assignments to and from students? How do you provide feedback? How do you inspire collaborative learning and student-centered learning? Those are some things to consider. But another thing to consider as well is the whole idea of which blended learning model are you going to use? Are you going to use a lab rotation where half the time is spent in a lab and the other half is spent in the classroom? That may work for certain learning environments. It certainly did when I first started teaching high school at a public high school in Pennsylvania. Or do you do like a elementary station rotation where there's 3 different groups? There's an independent practice group, there's a technology group, there's direct instruction. So that's something to consider. There's also the a la carte model where you customize sort of like a playlist for students based upon their needs. And we talked about that last week. So there's a lot of different things to consider, But your learning model, I think, one of my biggest concerns is that it shouldn't be just the flavor of the day, something that you just think is cool. It should be what's best to meet the learning goal. So when you have a clear learning goal and you're clear on the goal, you know how to be flexible on the means. And so that's really, really important when thinking about designing learning environments for students.